there are cases that I've had where the system has truly functioned to change somebody's life and to make society better, I think, and you can see it happening in front of you. But one of the cases that came in was a case dealing with a man who had been charged with child neglect. And in listening to the evidence that was presented, it was clear to me that this man was in on a child neglect, child abuse charge with an infant child, principally because he didn't know how to take care of the child. He didn't know how. It's not that he was intentionally abusing the child, although certainly that's what was happening. And I decided in my own mind, after listening to the evidence, that he simply didn't know how to change diapers, didn't know how to feed a child properly. So he asked for a chance, and he'd had a couple of them. The system really had reached its limits. So I told him, why don't you go home, and I want you to do something for me. You know, I did the sentencing and said, I'd like you to go back to your house and tonight look at your child when your child is sleeping, and I want you just to stand there, and I want you to understand that you may not have that child. That child may be taken away from you, and I want you back in a week. He came back in a week, and he hadn't been working. He had a suit on, he had a tie on, he'd made 6 or 7 job contacts. And I was impressed enough with what he was trying to do and the support that he was getting from social services to give him another week or two. And by the time he came back, he had a job, he had somebody helping take care of the child. So I continued it for another 6 weeks. And when he came back, I was impressed enough to bring him back in another 3 months. And then the case we dismissed because he had so completely turned around. And it wasn't a law that did it. It wasn't it wasn't having to report in every week that did it. It was telling him, you know, this is what I'm seeing when I look at you. Now you go home and you look at your child. Take 5 minutes without anyone telling you what you have to do, and recognize the consequences to you personally and your child. And we didn't see him again. And that one little case that probably took 2 hours of my entire judicial career is probably the one or two that I remember the most, because the system worked, but I felt that as a judge I was able to connect with the defendant and change and immediately see the change in that person.
The things that you learn and the narratives that will emerge in a family conference are different than those that emerge in the trial of a neglect case. And I think it's important that they emerge. But I also think that their emergence will lead us to ways of interpreting child welfare laws that take account of those narratives. So that ultimately they will not be shut off even in the trial of a neglect case. And I think it's that same process of education and increasing appreciation of context that makes law able to function in a more sensitive way, even when it's functioning in a traditional litigation mode.
You can't solve a person's problem unless you're able to analyze it, and analyze it in terms of all the elements. They don't have to be law-related necessarily. The problems may be psychological, the problems may be economic, and you only bring the law into them, into the solution, where that is one of the preferred paths for going.
You know, the whole cause of Western civilization, as opposed to other civilizations, its progressive character, depends entirely on the notion of the ideal, that we are capable of imagining an alternative to what exists. And then we're capable of making the ideal actual. And I want just people to have the courage again to remember that idea, the idea of the ideal. It's just a question of courage to remember that the actual is not all that is possible.
The judicial community undertakes a strong commitment to not only adjudicating case by case, not only deciding what sentence should be given in any particular set of circumstances that are brought before it, but rather looking in a broader sense as to why people are coming to us over and over with the same situations, why we have not been more creative in doing things that will keep them out of that isolated box of a particular adjudication in their case, but rather moving as a body to create some solutions for our litigants. And perhaps that will not be as dramatic as a winner-take-all situation or a guilty verdict that makes the headlines, but it will be aimed more at solving the problems that brought these people before our tribunals in the first place.
Any view which gets away from stereotyped views of social structures and social conflicts and so is wonderful to me. I just want lateral thinking on all these things, just thinking of away from the systematic structures, you know, which are structures of ideas, but they're also structures of power that dominate us, and which we treat as inevitable and necessary, when of course they're not.